The sun dipped low, its golden light spilling across the dusty trading outpost square, the air heavy with the scent of dry earth, sweat, and worn leather. A weathered wooden platform stood at the center, its boards warped and stained, a stage for the day's harsh barter. The crowd pressed close, rough-hewn traders, grizzled settlers, their faces shadowed by wide hats, their voices a low growl of bids and jeers. For young girls stood bound, their wrists chafed by coarse rope, their dresses tattered and mismatched, their faces streaked with dirt and silent tears. They were sisters, Lila, Mara, Etta, and Joe, orphaned by a raid, their voices stolen by trauma, their eyes wide with fear but empty of sound. The auctioneer's voice boomed, his gavel tapping a relentless rhythm, the bids rising. $6, $9, $12, each offer a chain on their fragile hope. A man lingered at the edge, his figure lean and weathered, his hat pulled low over a face carved by solitude. His name was Elias Holt, a rancher hardened by loss, his wife taken by fever, his heart closed to the thought of children. He'd turned from family, preferring the silence of his sprawling land to the noise of Offspring. Yet something in the girl's silent stares, haunted, pleading, stirred a buried ache. The bids climbed, a burly merchant with a scarred cheek offering $15, his grin predatory. Elias stepped forward, his boots scuffing the dirt, his voice rough. $3. Laughter erupted, the auctioneer pausing, his brow furrowing at the paltry sum. Whispers swirled, but the gavel fell with a crack. Sold the whole. The girl's shoulders slumped, their eyes darting to Elias, expecting cruelty or neglect, their silence a shield against the world. He approached, his hands unsteady as he untied the ropes himself, the fibers biting his fingers. Their wrists bled, faint red lines against their pale skin, their hands trembling as they rubbed them. He offered a dented canteen, its metal warm from the day, his voice gruff. Drink. They hesitated, Lila, the eldest at 12, taking it first, the water cool against their parched throats, a cautious nod passing between them. The crowd dispersed, their jeers fading, leaving a heavy silence that settled like dust. They walked to his ranch, a mile of cracked earth and stunted brush stretching between the outpost and his solitary claim. Elias led, his pace steady, his mind a storm of doubt and resolve. The girls followed, their steps uneven, their minds a whirl of fear and exhaustion, their tattered dresses catching on thorns. The ranch house loomed, a sagging porch, a chimney cold, its windows clouded with grime. He pushed the door open, gesturing inside with a nod. "You stay here," he said, pointing to a corner with a row of thin pallets and worn blankets. They froze, Mara clutching at his hand, their voices absent, their eyes questioning. He grunted, his answer curt. "Ain't fit for you in the barn." The room stood sparse, its walls rough-hewn, the air smelling of earth and neglect. The girls huddled together, their hands clutching the blankets, the fabric coarse against their skin, their past a shadow, flames, screams, silence. Elias sat by a rickety table, his rifle propped against the wall, its barrel glinting faintly, his face etched with lines of grief and reluctance. He watched them, his trust a distant ember, his eyes tracing their small forms, the weight of their silence pressing on him. The night deepened, the wind rattling the loose shutters, a lonely howl echoing across the plains. They lay on the pallets, the straw prickling their skin, their minds spinning with questions. His mercy, their fate, the strange turn their lives had taken. Morning broke, pale light seeping through the dusty panes, the air cool before the heat rose. Elias woke to the faint rustle of the girls moving, their silent coordination a quiet dance. He stepped outside, the sound of his axe splitting with a steady rhythm. They joined him, Lila taking a small hatchet, her hands trembling but determined, the wood splitting under her effort. He paused, wiping sweat from his brow, his eyes narrowing. "You don't need to," he said, his tone gruff, a hint of unease in it. They looked at him, their silence a response, their actions a plea. They worked side by side, the pile growing, dust clinging to their dresses, his shirt stained, their efforts a fragile bond. The day dragged on, the sun climbing high, its heat pressing down on the barren fields beyond. Elias cooked, his hands clumsy with a skillet, the smell of burned beans filling the space, a stark contrast to the meals he'd once shared. The girls ate, their movements slow, their silence a heavy presence. He sat across, his plate untouched for a moment, his voice breaking the quiet. "Why'd I do this?" he muttered, half to himself. They looked at him, Joe, the youngest at 6, reaching a small hand toward him, her eyes soft. His heart shifted, a thread of understanding weaving through his reluctance. The $3 a burden turning to purpose. Evening fell, the sky bruising with dusk, the hearth lit, its warmth spreading. Elias sat, his rifle leaned against the wall, his face softened by the firelight. The girls watched, their hands still, their minds on the day's labor, the unexpected shelter. The night deepened, the fire crackling, their silence a fragile bridge. He spoke, his voice low. This place was mine alone. They listened, their eyes reflecting his, their shared need a spark against his closed heart. The night stretched long, the ranch house cloaked in the hearth's faint glow, the air thick with the scent of burning sage and the musty damp of aged wood. Elias Holt sat by the rickety table, his rifle propped against the wall, its barrel glinting faintly in the firelight, his face a mask of weathered lines and reluctant resolve. The 4 girls, Lila, Mara, Etta, and Joe, huddled on their pallets, their small forms wrapped in tattered blankets, their wrists still tender from the ropes, faint red marks fading against their skin. The fire crackled softly, its warmth a fragile shield against the cold silence that had defined this place before their arrival. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the loose shutters, a lonely sound that echoed the isolation Elias had embraced for years. Their presence, though thrust upon him, stirred the air, a quiet challenge to his solitary life. He watched them, his gaze steady, noting the way Lila, the eldest at 12, held Mara close, her protective arm a silent vow, while Etta and Joe clung together, their eyes wide but voiceless. The $3 he'd bid had bought their bodies, but their spirits remained a mystery, their silence a wall he hadn't yet scaled. Elias rose, his steps heavy across the creaking floor, and added a log to the fire, the wood hissing as flames licked its edges, the crackle a sharp break in the stillness. Lila glanced up, her dark eyes wary, her head tilting as if to speak, but no sound came. He muttered, his voice gruff, "You don't need to fear me," his tone rough but carrying a hint of intent. She nodded, a cautious movement, her hands tightening on the blanket. The gesture felt small, yet it stirred a memory in him, of a time when his home had known care, a time lost to grief. Morning crept in, the light pale and dusty through the cracked panes, the air cool before the sun's heat took hold. Elias woke to the faint rustle of the girls moving, their silent coordination a quiet dance as they straightened their pallets. He stepped outside, the sound of his axe splitting with a steady rhythm against the quiet ranch. They joined him, Lila taking a small hatchet, her hands trembling but determined, the wood splitting under her effort, while Mara and Etta gathered kindling, and Joe watched with wide eyes. He paused, wiping sweat from his brow, his eyes narrowing as he studied them. "You don't have to work," he said, his tone gruff, a flicker of unease in it, as if their effort unsettled his resolve. They looked at him, their silence a response, their actions a plea, their small hands moving with purpose. The day wore on, the sun climbing high, its heat pressing down on the barren fields beyond the house. Elias cooked, his hands clumsy with a rusted skillet, the smell of scorched beans filling the space, a stark contrast to the meals he'd once shared with his wife. The girls ate, their movements slow, their silence a heavy presence, Lila distributing portions with a nod. He sat across, his plate untouched for a moment, his voice breaking the quiet. "Why'd I do this?" he muttered, half to himself, his mind wrestling with the choice. Lila met his gaze, her eyes steady, reaching a small hand toward him, a gesture of trust. His heart shifted, a thread of understanding weaving through his reluctance. The $3 a wait he hadn't foreseen. The afternoon brought a shift, the heat easing as shadows lengthened. Clara swept the porch, her movements deliberate, the broom stirring dust into small clouds that danced in the light. Gideon repaired a fence, his hammer ringing against nails, his figure a stark contrast against the vastness of the plains. She watched him, her mind drifting to the auction, the laughter, the moment she'd claimed him, her pity a lifeline he hadn't expected. The porch clean, she sat, her hands resting on her knees, her gaze on the horizon where the mountains loomed. Gideon joined her, his tools set aside, his breath steadying. "This place is dead," he said, his voice low, his eyes on the fields. "Maybe not forever." She nodded, her silence a response, her presence a quiet promise. Night fell, the sky bruising with dusk, the hearth rebuilt, its warmth spreading through the room. Elias sat, his rifle leaned against the wall, his face softened by the firelight, the lines of grief less pronounced. The girls watched, their hands still, their minds on the day's labor, the unexpected shelter. He spoke, his voice low, testing the air. "Lost my wife. This place was mine alone." They listened, their eyes reflecting his, Lila nodding faintly, her hand resting on Mara's. Their shared pain hung between them, a thread of connection weaving through the silence, his heart a spark against their voiceless need. The fire crackled, the night deepening, their bond a fragile beginning. The hours passed, the fire dying to embers, the room bathed in a soft glow. Elias rose, his steps heavy, and fetched water from a bucket, pouring it into tin cups. He handed one to Lila, his fingers brushing hers, a jolt passing between them, brief but tangible. She took it, her eyes meeting his, a flicker of gratitude breaking through. He sat again, his gaze on the embers, his mind turning. The ranch house, once a tomb of solitude, felt different, alive, tentative, a space where his rejection might yield to something more. The wind died, the shutters still, their silence a fragile bridge, the girl's presence a quiet call to a new life. The dawn broke soft, the sky a pale wash over the ranch, the air cool with the promise of heat, carrying the faint scent of sage and dew-damp earth. The ranch house stood quiet, its walls creaking under the weight of time, the hearth's embers glowing faintly in the dim light. Elias Holt woke on a worn chair, his rifle still propped against the table, his body stiff from the night, his mind heavy with the girl's silent presence. Lila, Mara, Etta, and Joe stirred on their pallets, their small forms wrapped in tattered blankets, their wrists healed but their eyes still shadowed by a voiceless past. The distant cry of a hawk pierced the stillness, a lone sound against the vast plains. He rose, his steps heavy across the creaking floor, and stoked the fire, adding a log with care, the flames leaping upward, their warmth spreading slowly through the room. The girls watched him, their gazes steady, Lila, the eldest at 12, guiding Mara with a nod, while Etta and Joe clung close, their silence a bond unbroken by words. Elias met their eyes, his face softening, a flicker of something new breaking through his guarded stare. "You don't have to hide," he muttered, his voice rough, the words a clumsy offer of safety. Lila tilted her head, her dark eyes searching his, then nodded faintly, her hands smoothing Mara's hair. The gesture stirred him, a memory of his wife's touch flickering in his mind, a time when this house had known gentleness. They ate together, the scorched beans shared in silence, the act a small ritual that began to fill the empty space between them. The day stretched long, the sun climbing high, its heat pressing down on the barren fields beyond the house. Elias worked with them, his hands gripping a hoe, the metal biting into the hard earth, his strength matched by Lila's small but determined swings with a trowel, while Mara and Etta carried water, and Joe trailed with a bucket. He paused, wiping sweat from his brow, his eyes narrowing as he studied them. "You're tougher than I thought," he said, the words almost lost in the breeze, a rare note of respect in his voice. They looked at him, their silence a response, their actions a quiet defiance of the roles they'd been sold into. Dust clung to their dresses, his shirt stained, their efforts a fragile thread of unity. A shadow moved on the horizon, a dark smudge against the endless sky, growing larger with each passing moment. Elias tensed, his hand drifting to the rifle, his face hardening as he squinted into the distance. The girls followed his gaze, their hearts quickening, their hands pausing on their tools. 3 riders approached, their figures emerging from the haze, their hats low, their horses kicking up dust in a rolling cloud. "Halt!" one called, his voice sharp and commanding, cutting through the stillness. "Those girls are ours, traded fair. Give them back." Elias stepped forward, his stance firm, his rifle in hand. "They're mine now." "Leave," he said, his voice steady, a protective edge to it. The leader smirked, his hand resting on a holster, his eyes cold. The girls stood close, their silence a shield, their trust in him growing. The standoff lingered, the air thick with tension, the sun beating down mercilessly. Elias's voice rose, firm and unyielding. $3 bought their freedom. You got no claim here. The leader spat into the dust, his gaze flickering between Elias and the girls, then signaled to his men. A shot rang out, the bullet kicking up dirt near his boots, a warning rather than a strike. Lila grabbed a stick, her stance firm, her eyes fierce, while Mara and Etta flanked her, and Joe clung to Elias's leg. The leader hesitated, his smirk fading, then nodded, the riders turning their horses and retreating into the haze, their dust settling slowly. Elias exhaled, his hand brushing Lila's shoulder, a fleeting touch that carried a silent thanks. She nodded, her eyes meeting his, a crack in his reluctance. They returned to the house, the hearth waiting, its fire a symbol of their fragile alliance. The girls sat, their hands trembling slightly as they wiped dust from their faces, their minds racing with the day's events. Elias leaned a rifle against the wall, his hands shaking, his breath ragged from the confrontation. He poured water from a bucket, the tin cups clinking as he handed one to Lila, his fingers brushing hers, a jolt passing between them. She took it, her eyes steady, a flicker of gratitude breaking through. "Thank you," he said, the words rough but sincere, his voice carrying a weight he hadn't felt before. They nodded, sitting close, their gaze on the flames, their past, raids, silence, fear, mirroring his loss. Night fell, the stars piercing the sky, the heart's warmth spreading through the room. Elias spoke, his voice soft, breaking the silence. "Lost her, my wife. This place died with her." The girls listened, their eyes reflecting his, Lila resting a hand on Mara's, a silent echo of his grief. Their shared pain hung between them, a thread of connection weaving through the air, his heart a spark against their voiceless need. He rose, his steps light, and fetched a rag, wetting it to clean the dust from his hands, the water cool against his skin. They watched, their silence lighter, the room feeling less like a prison and more like a shared space. The fire crackled, the night deepening, their bond strengthening with each quiet moment. The hours passed, the embers glowing, the house settling into a rare peace. Lila patched a tear in Joe's dress, her fingers deft, the needle glinting in the firelight. Elias sat, his hands idle for once, his gaze on them, a shift in his demeanor, less guarded, more present. Etta crawled closer, her small hand touching his boot, a tentative gesture. He froze, then relaxed, his rejection fading, a new purpose taking root. The wind died, the shutters still, their silence a fragile promise, the ranch a canvas for a family reborn. The night deepened, the ranch house bathed in the hearth's warm glow, the air thick with the scent of burning sage and the faint musk of old timber. Elias Holt sat by the fire, his rifle leaning against the wall, its barrel glinting faintly in the firelight, his face a map of weathered lines and growing resolve. Lila, Mura, Etta, and Joe huddled close on their pallets, their small forms wrapped in patch blankets, their wrists healed but their eyes still shadowed by the day's standoff. The flames pulsed, casting flickering shadows across the room, the silence broken only by the occasional pop of wood. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, a restless sound that mirrored the tension lingering from the rider's threat. Their presence had become a tether, pulling him from the abyss of solitude. Yet the danger loomed, a shadow over their fragile peace. He watched them, his gaze steady, noting the way Lila's hand rested on Mara's shoulder, a silent comfort, while Etta and Joe leaned into each other, their voiceless bond of strength he couldn't ignore. The $3 he'd bid had bought their safety, but their spirits, silent yet resilient, challenged his reluctance, weaving a connection he hadn't sought. Elias rose, his steps deliberate across the creaking floor, and added a log to the fire, the wood hissing as flames licked its edges, the crackle a sharp break in the stillness. Lila glanced up, her dark eyes meeting his, a flicker of trust breaking through her wariness. "You held us," he said, his voice rough, the words a clumsy acknowledgement of their stand together. She nodded, her hand tightening on Mara's, the gesture a quiet thanks. Morning broke, the sky streaked with red, the fields stark under the rising sun, the air cool before the heat took hold. Elias cooked, his hands steadier with the skillet, the smell of beans and cornbread filling the space, a faint echo of meals he'd once shared. The girls ate, their movements synchronized, their silence a heavy presence, Lila distributing portions with a nod. He sat across, his plate untouched for a moment, his voice breaking the quiet. "You're changing this place," he said, his tone low, a confession slipping out. They looked at him, Joe, the youngest at 6, reaching a small hand toward him, her eyes soft. His heart shifted, a thread of warmth weaving through his guarded soul. The $3 a symbol of a bond he couldn't deny. The riders returned, their horses thundering across the plain, their figures dark against the horizon, the sound a drumbeat of renewed conflict. Elias stepped out, the girls at his side, Lila clutching a stick, her stance firm, while Mara and Etta flanked her and Joe clung to his leg. The leader dismounted, his face weathered, his voice cold and edged with menace. "Those girls are ours, Holt. $3 won't hold them. Hand them over." Elias's jaw tightened, his rifle raised, his voice steady. "They stay. You leave." A shot rang out, the bullet whizzing past, kicking up dirt near his boots, a warning that stilled the air. Lila stepped forward, her stick raised, her eyes fierce, the girls a united front beside him. The fight erupted, brief but fierce. Elias ducked, his rifle firing, the crack echoing, one rider falling with a grunt. Lila swung her stick, its tip grazing the leader's arm, forcing him back, while Mara and Etta threw rocks, their small forms a blur of defiance. The third rider hesitated, then turned, the others retreating, their horses kicking up dust as they fled. Inside, the tension broke, Elias lowering his rifle, his hands trembling, his breath ragged. The girls dropped their weapons, their hands shaking, their eyes wide with adrenaline. Lila touched his arm, her fingers warm, her silence a profound thanks. He looked at her, his eyes wet, his voice breaking. "Couldn't let them take you." She nodded, her heart shifting, a bond deepening in the aftermath. Days passed, the ranch stirring with life despite the threat. The girls planted seeds, their hands in the soil, hope in their touch, the earth yielding under their care. Elias watched, his steps lighter, his reluctance easing with each green shoot. Lila guided Joe's small hands, her strength a teacher's, while Mara and Etta carried water, their silence a rhythm. He joined them, his shovel matching their pace, his past, loss, isolation, fading in their light. Night fell, the fire warm, their hands brushing as Lila handed him a cup, a quiet intimacy growing. He spoke, his voice halting. "Thought I'd die alone. You're showing me different." She smiled, her eyes meeting his, a silent promise taking root. The ranch transformed, the barn repaired, the fields greening, a testament to their shared effort. Elias carved a small mark on the table, for lines joined by a circle, his first gesture of family. The girls traced it, their fingers lingering, a nod sealing their bond. The plains stretched vast, but the house held them, a sanctuary built on trust, not rejection. His heart, once closed, opened to their voiceless need, a new purpose born from the ashes of his solitude. The dawn broke gentle, the sky a soft wash of pink over the ranch, the air cool with the promise of a new day, carrying the scent of green shoots and dew-damp earth. The ranch house stood stronger, its porch swept, the hearth alive with a steady fire, its warmth a testament to the life within. Elias Holt woke on a chair by the table, his rifle now a decoration rather than a guard, his body eased by rest, his mind light with a purpose he hadn't known. Lila, Mara, Etta, and Joe stirred on their pallets, their small forms wrapped in blankets they'd mended together, their wrists smooth, their eyes bright with a hope that had begun to bloom. The distant call of a hawk pierced the stillness, a sound of freedom against the vast plains. He rose, his steps light across the creaking floor, and stoked the fire, the flames leaping, their warmth spreading a quiet peace. The girls watched him, their gazes steady, Lila guiding Mara with a nod, while Etta and Joe smiled silently, their voiceless bond of strength that had reshaped this place. Elias met their eyes, his face softening, a smile tugging at his lips, a rare sight born of their shared journey. "You've made this home," he said, his voice rough but warm, the words a clumsy gift of gratitude. Lila tilted her head, her dark eyes shining, then nodded, her hand resting on Joe's, a gesture that sealed their family. They ate together, the cornbread and beans shared in silence, the act a ritual that filled the room with a new harmony, the $3 a distant memory of their beginning. The day unfolded, the sun climbing high, its heat tempered by a breeze, the fields beyond the house thick with green shoots, a harvest in the making. Elias worked with them, his hands guiding a plow, the metal cutting the earth, his strength matched by Lila's steady trowel, while Mara and Etta planted seeds, and Joe watered with a small can. He paused, wiping sweat from his brow, his eyes warm as he watched them. "You're my strength," he said, the words soft, a confession of his transformation. They looked at him, their silence a response, their actions a quiet triumph over the past. Dust clung to their dresses, his shirt stained, their efforts a living bond. The rider's threat had faded, a distant echo, but a new challenge arose, a drought, the sky dry, the creek shrinking. Elias stood on the porch, his gaze on the parched land, his heart heavy. The girls joined him, Lila pointing to a distant spring, her eyes determined. They trekked together, his shovel digging a channel, their small hands carrying water, their silence a rhythm of hope. The creek flowed again, a lifeline restored, their faces bright with silent joy. He knelt, his hand on Joe's shoulder, his voice low. "We did this." She nodded, her smile wide, their unity a victory. The ranch thrived, the barn repaired, the fields yielding, a sanctuary built on trust. Elias carved a larger mark on the barn door, for lines joined by a circle, now painted with clay, his gesture of family. The girls traced it, their fingers lingering, a nod sealing their bond. He taught them signs, simple gestures, Lila for strength, Mara for care, Etta for joy, Joe for love, his voice filling the silence, their eyes learning. Night fell, the sky ablaze with stars, the hearth crackling. They sat close, Lila handing him a cup, her touch warm, a quiet intimacy growing. He spoke, his voice steady. "I was wrong. You're my daughters." They smiled, their hands signing back, a family complete. The months passed, the ranch a home, the fields lush, the barn full. Elias watched them play, their laughter mute but real, their spirits free. He joined them, his hands building a swing, their eyes shining. The plains stretched vast, but the house held them, a triumph of will over rejection. His heart, once closed, embraced their voiceless need, a love born from the ashes of his solitude. The night deepened, the fire warm, their silence a comfort. He sat, his hands idle, his soul at peace, the girls huddled close, their bond a quiet fire that lit his days.